You ever notice how the people who understand systems the least are always the ones making decisions about them? I'm Preston, and I used to architect APIs at Mountainfire Technologies. Used to. Past tense. Until our CTO decided that speed mattered more than stability, that shipping features was more important than building foundations that wouldn't crumble the moment someone breathed on them wrong. She made a choice that day, standing in my office with her tablet glowing between us like a barrier. She reassigned my API integration work to someone else. Not because I was failing. Not because I'd missed deadlines or delivered broken code. Because he shipped features faster than I did, she said. Casually. Like she was commenting on the weather. I stepped aside. You know that feeling when someone dismisses the thing you've poured yourself into? When they look at months of careful architecture, thoughtful design, obsessive documentation, and decide it doesn't matter because someone else can slap together endpoints quicker? You're standing there, and you want to argue. You want to explain why speed without understanding is just velocity toward disaster. But you also know that in that moment, nothing you say will matter. They've already decided. They've already chosen the narrative where you're the bottleneck, the perfectionist who can't keep up with the demands of modern development. So you smile. You nod. You say something professional about supporting the transition. And you step aside. But here's what they don't understand: stepping aside isn't the same as walking away. The thing about complex systems is that they reveal themselves slowly. When you build something the right way, you're not just writing code that works today. You're anticipating the failures of tomorrow. You're thinking about edge cases that haven't happened yet, about scaling problems that won't surface until you're 3 times your current size, about integration patterns that need to hold steady when 20 different services are hammering your endpoints simultaneously. It's invisible work. It doesn't show up in velocity metrics or sprint retrospectives. It's the foundation beneath the foundation, and nobody notices it until it's gone. Bryce Kellerman was the developer our CTO chose to replace me. Young, energetic, one of those programmers who measured success in commits per day and lines of code written. He had that confidence that comes from never having experienced a catastrophic system failure that was entirely your fault. I'd worked with developers like him before. They're not malicious. They're just inexperienced. They see the surface of things. They think an API is just a contract between services, a series of endpoints that return JSON. They don't understand that an API is actually a promise, a commitment to consistency and reliability that dozens of other systems will build their entire existence around. Our CTO, Chloe Winters, had come up through the business side. Marketing, product management, eventually executive leadership. She understood growth metrics and user acquisition. She could talk eloquently about market positioning and competitive advantages. But she'd never written production code. Never been paged at 3 a.m. because a memory leak was bringing down critical infrastructure. Never had to explain to a room full of angry stakeholders why their entire operation had gone dark because someone changed a response format without considering downstream dependencies. When she told me about the reassignment, I asked one question. Just one. Has Bryce worked with webhook systems before? She waved her hand dismissively. He'll figure it out. He's smart, and he moves fast. That's what we need right now. That's what we need right now. As if what we needed was less thought and more action, as if the problem with our infrastructure was that it was too carefully constructed. I went back to my desk and did exactly what she'd asked. I handed over my documentation. All of it. 70 pages of architectural decisions, integration patterns, error handling strategies, rate limiting considerations, authentication flows, webhook delivery guarantees, retry logic, circuit breaker implementations. I'd spent 4 months building the foundation for our integration platform, thinking through every scenario, every failure mode, every edge case. Bryce got all of it, neatly packaged in a shared drive folder with a cheerful handoff email. Here's what I didn't tell him: documentation only helps if you read it. The first week after the transition, things seemed fine. Bryce shipped 3 new integration endpoints in the time it would have taken me to ship one. Chloe was thrilled. She mentioned it in the all-hands meeting, held him up as an example of the kind of execution velocity we needed across engineering. I sat in the back of that meeting, listening to her praise his speed, and I thought about the webhook delivery system he'd modified. The one with the carefully calibrated retry logic that prevented infinite loops during partner service outages. I wondered if he'd understood why that logic existed. I wondered if he'd tested the failure scenarios. I didn't have to wonder for long. 3 days after she'd reassigned my work, Chloe burst into the engineering floor. Not walked. Burst. Her face was flushed, her voice sharp with panic. "Why are all our integrations broken?" she demanded, looking directly at me even though the work wasn't mine anymore. "We have 17 enterprise clients reporting complete failure of their webhook deliveries. Our support queue has exploded. What's happening?" The room went silent. Every developer stopped typing. Bryce looked like he'd been struck. He stammered something about checking the logs, about not understanding what could have gone wrong. The endpoints were working, he insisted. He'd tested them. They returned successful responses. I stood up slowly. Walked to the main monitoring dashboard. Pulled up the webhook delivery metrics that I'd built into the system specifically for moments like this. The graph was devastating, a 97% failure rate on delivery attempts, with our retry queues backing up into the millions. Our integration platform was suffocating under the weight of its own error handling. "What did you change in the retry logic?" I asked Bryce, keeping my voice neutral. He pulled up his recent commits. There it was, a simplification of the webhook delivery system. He'd looked at my carefully structured retry mechanism with its exponential backoff, its circuit breakers, its dead letter queues, and decided it was overcomplicated. Too much code for what he saw as a simple problem. He'd replaced it with basic linear retries. When a webhook failed to deliver, his new system would try again immediately. And again. And again. No backoff. No circuit breaking. No understanding that when a partner service goes down, hammering it with retry attempts doesn't bring it back faster. It just creates a cascading failure that brings down your own infrastructure in the process. One of our major partners had experienced a brief service disruption that morning. Completely normal. Happens all the time. My original system would have detected the outage, opened a circuit breaker, queued the webhooks for later delivery, and moved on. Bryce's simplified system saw the failures and went into an infinite retry spiral. Thousands of webhook attempts per second, overwhelming our own infrastructure, triggering rate limits, causing our API gateway to start rejecting legitimate traffic, creating a feedback loop of failures that spread across every integration we managed. Chloe was staring at the dashboard like it was a foreign language. "Can you fix this?" she asked me. I could have jumped in, reverted Bryce's changes, stabilized the system, and been the hero. That's what the old Alice would have done. The one who believed that competence and reliability would eventually be recognized and valued. But I'd learned something in that moment when Chloe had casually dismissed months of careful work because someone else moved faster. I'd learned that in organizations like this, being good at your job isn't enough. Being reliable isn't enough. You can be the person who prevents disasters, who builds systems that scale, who thinks 3 steps ahead, and still be seen as too slow, too cautious, too focused on problems that haven't happened yet. "That's not my responsibility anymore," I said quietly. "You reassigned this work to Bryce because he ships faster. This is his area now." The look on her face was something between shock and fury. She'd expected me to fix her mistake. To clean up the mess. To prove that I was still valuable by rescuing the situation she'd created by devaluing my work. But I was done playing that game. Done being the safety net that made reckless decisions seem consequence-free. The outage lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of enterprise clients unable to receive critical data updates. 6 hours of support tickets flooding in. 6 hours of our reputation taking damage in real time on social media as frustrated developers complained about our platform's unreliability. By the end of it, Bryce had managed to revert his changes, but the damage was done. 3 enterprise clients canceled their contracts that week. 2 more downgraded to basic tiers. The revenue impact was immediate and quantifiable. But here's the thing about organizational failure, it's never really about one person's mistake. Bryce had made an error, sure. He'd oversimplified something complex because he didn't understand the context. But the real failure was systemic. It was in the decision to prioritize speed over understanding. In the choice to measure productivity by features shipped rather than by stability maintained. In the assumption that anyone could do the work as long as they moved fast enough. I started documenting everything after that. Not just technical documentation, though I kept that meticulous. I documented decision-making patterns. Email threads where I'd raised concerns about sustainability and been told we needed to move faster. Architecture review meetings where I'd pointed out potential failure modes and been overruled in favor of quicker implementations. Incidents where corner cutting had led to problems, and the subsequent scrambles to fix them. I built a comprehensive record of how Mountainfire Technologies made technical decisions, and more importantly, how those decisions created risk. You might think I was planning a lawsuit. I wasn't. I was planning something more elegant. 2 weeks after the integration disaster, our VP of Engineering scheduled a one-on-one with me. Frank Whitmore was old school, had actually written code for the first 15 years of his career before moving into management. He understood systems in a way Chloe never would. He closed the door to the conference room and sat across from me with the weight of someone who knew exactly how bad things were. "Walk me through what happened," he said. Not accusatory. Just tired. I did. I explained the architectural decisions I'd made and why. The failure scenarios I'd planned for. The simplifications Bryce had introduced and their consequences. I showed him the documentation I'd handed over and the sections that hadn't been read. I laid out the technical debt that was accumulating across our entire platform because we were optimizing for velocity instead of sustainability. Frank listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "What would you need to fix this properly?" It was a test, I realized. He was giving me a chance to ask for resources, for authority, for the things I'd need to rebuild what had been degraded. But I'd already decided I wasn't interested in fixing Mountainfire's problems anymore. They'd made it clear my approach wasn't valued. I wasn't going to fight for the opportunity to prove them wrong. A team that understands the difference between moving fast and moving recklessly, I said. Leadership that measures success by system stability, not just feature velocity. And decision-makers who have actually experienced the consequences of technical failure firsthand. His expression told me he understood what I was really saying. I was describing an organization that wasn't Mountainfire. I started interviewing at other companies the next day. Quietly. No dramatic announcements. I showed up, did my newly reduced scope of work, and spent my evenings talking to engineering leaders who actually understood what I did. The contrast was striking. These were CTOs and VPs who asked detailed questions about failure handling and error budgets. Who wanted to know how I thought about system design and operational resilience. Who saw speed as one variable among many, not the only variable that mattered. Meanwhile, Mountainfire was discovering the full extent of its technical debt. The integration disaster had been a symptom, not the disease. The disease was years of prioritizing shipping over stability, of promoting developers based on output rather than impact, of treating infrastructure as a cost center rather than a competitive advantage. Systems were failing in small ways constantly now. Not catastrophically, not in ways that made headlines, but in the grinding, exhausting way that slowly destroys a platform's reliability. Bryce was drowning. I could see it in his face during stand-ups, in the way his confident swagger had been replaced by defensive explanations and constant firefighting. He'd learned the hard way what I'd tried to teach through documentation, that complex systems are complex for a reason, that shortcuts create debt, that speed without understanding is just expensive failure in slow motion. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. But he'd been so certain that my caution was just slowness, that my thoroughness was just overthinking. Some lessons you can only learn by experiencing the consequences. Chloe, though. Chloe was getting desperate. She'd built her reputation on transforming Mountainfire into a fast-moving, feature-shipping machine. The integration outage had damaged that narrative. The ongoing stability problems were making it worse. She needed wins. She needed to show that her approach was right, that the problems were just temporary growing pains, that velocity would ultimately triumph over caution. She started pushing harder. More features, faster timelines, less time for testing and review. The engineering team was burning out. 2 senior developers quit in the same week. Both of them cited unsustainable pace and lack of technical leadership in their exit interviews. I heard about it through the grapevine, the way you hear about everything in a struggling organization where people need to vent just to survive. That's when I made my move. I'd been at Mountainfire for 6 years. 6 years of building systems, mentoring developers, establishing patterns and practices. I knew where all the bodies were buried because I'd buried half of them myself. Technical decisions that had been made for business reasons, shortcuts that had been taken to hit deadlines, architectural compromises that had never been properly addressed. I had documentation going back to the beginning, a comprehensive map of Mountainfire's technical infrastructure and all its carefully hidden weaknesses. I compiled it into a report. Not a hit piece, nothing inflammatory or emotional. Just a clear, factual assessment of Mountainfire's technical state. Current stability metrics. Trend lines showing degradation over time. Specific incidents and their root causes. Projected costs of the accumulated technical debt. Risk assessment for the most critical systems. And recommendations, detailed and specific, for how to address the problems before they became existential. I sent it to Frank first. Gave him a week to read it and respond. He scheduled a meeting for the following Monday, and when I walked into his office, the report was sitting on his desk covered in sticky notes and annotations. "This is damning," he said simply. "This is accurate," I replied. He asked if I'd be willing to present it to the executive team. To make the case for a fundamental shift in how Mountainfire approached technical development. I told him I would, on one condition: I wanted Chloe in the room, and I wanted her to have to defend her decisions in front of her peers. The presentation was scheduled for a Friday morning. The executive conference room, the one with the long table and the windows overlooking the city. The CEO was there, the CFO, the heads of product and sales and marketing. And Chloe, sitting across from me with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral. I walked them through it methodically. Started with our stability metrics from 2 years ago, when I'd been leading the infrastructure work. Showed how they'd degraded since Chloe had begun her velocity-focused transformation. Highlighted the integration disaster and traced its root cause back to specific decision-making patterns. Showed them the revenue impact of the recent client cancellations. Projected future costs based on current trends. Then I showed them the alternative. What it would look like to rebuild properly. To hire for understanding instead of just output. To measure success by system reliability instead of feature count. To treat technical infrastructure as an investment rather than an expense. I had detailed roadmaps, resource requirements, timeline estimates. Everything an executive team would need to make an informed decision. Chloe tried to push back. Argued that my approach was too slow for the competitive landscape. That we needed to move fast to capture market share. That stability could come later, once we'd established dominance. She was articulate and passionate, and she might have won the argument if the CFO hadn't asked a single devastating question. How much did the integration outage cost us in lost contracts and reputation damage? Chloe hesitated. She hadn't wanted to quantify it, hadn't wanted to put a specific number on the consequences of her approach. But the CFO had already done the math. He read it out to the room: direct revenue loss from cancellations, projected loss from the clients who'd downgraded, estimated cost of the support response and engineering overtime, and an assessment of reputational damage based on social media sentiment and competitor positioning. It was a number that made everyone sit up straighter. And that was from one incident, the CFO continued. According to this report, we're experiencing smaller failures constantly. What's the cumulative cost of that? Chloe didn't have an answer. How could she? She'd never measured the cost of instability because she'd never believed it was a problem worth measuring. In her model, speed was the only variable that mattered. Everything else was just friction to be overcome. The CEO asked me directly, if we gave you authority to restructure how we approach technical development, what would you need? This was the moment. The opportunity to take control, to prove that my approach was right, to build the organization I'd been describing. It's what the old Alice would have wanted. The validation. The chance to be proven right after being dismissed. But I'd learned something important over the past few weeks. I'd learned that I didn't want to work at Mountainfire anymore, regardless of who was in charge or what authority I had. The culture was broken in ways that went beyond Chloe's decision-making. It was an organization that had spent years optimizing for the wrong things, that had promoted and rewarded people based on metrics that didn't actually correlate with value. Fixing that would take years, and it would be exhausting, and at the end of it I'd still be at a company that had once looked at my best work and decided it wasn't good enough because it didn't happen fast enough. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully. But I think Mountainfire needs someone who's invested in its future. Someone who hasn't spent the last month being reminded that their approach isn't valued here. The CEO blinked. He'd expected me to jump at the chance. You're turning down the opportunity to lead engineering? I'm declining the opportunity to fix problems that should never have been created, I said. I'm resigning, effective 2 weeks from today. I'll spend that time doing knowledge transfer and helping you understand the full scope of what needs to be addressed. But I won't be the one addressing it. The room erupted. The CEO tried to negotiate. Frank looked stricken. Even Chloe seemed shocked, though I couldn't tell if it was because I was leaving or because I'd just made her look catastrophically wrong in front of the entire executive team. But I was done. I'd made my case. I'd shown them exactly what was broken and exactly how to fix it. What they did with that information was their choice. I'd already made mine. My last 2 weeks at Mountainfire were strange. Chloe avoided me entirely, couldn't even make eye contact in the hallway. Frank kept trying to change my mind, offering me everything from equity packages to complete autonomy. The CEO had 3 separate meetings with me, each one a different angle on why I should stay. But I'd already accepted an offer from a company that actually valued what I did. A place where the CTO had spent an hour of our interview talking about failure handling and resilience patterns, where they measured success by uptime and recovery time, where move fast and break things was considered a cautionary tale rather than a philosophy. On my last day, I did one final thing. I documented everything I knew about Mountainfire's technical infrastructure. Every hidden dependency, every workaround, every piece of tribal knowledge that existed only in my head. I put it all in a comprehensive knowledge base, organized and searchable and thorough. And I handed it over to Bryce. He looked at me with something like fear. Why are you giving this to me? Because you're going to need it, I said simply. And because documentation only helps if someone reads it. Learn from that. I heard later, through former colleagues who kept in touch, what happened after I left. Chloe was reassigned to a strategic advisory role, which is corporate speak for removed from operational authority without the embarrassment of being fired. Frank took over as acting CTO while they searched for a permanent replacement. They hired the person I'd recommended, actually, someone who understood that technical leadership isn't about speed, it's about sustainability. Bryce eventually became a decent engineer. Not great, but decent. He learned to read documentation. To think about failure modes. To understand that complexity often exists for good reasons. My departure had been a wake-up call for him in a way the integration disaster hadn't been, because the disaster could be blamed on one mistake, but my leaving forced him to confront the systemic problems with how he approached his work. Mountainfire survived, barely. They lost market share. They spent 18 months rebuilding their technical foundation properly, the way I'd outlined in my report. They're stable now, from what I hear. Not innovative, not fast-moving, just stable. A platform that mostly works, most of the time. It's probably the best they could have hoped for given how far they'd fallen. As for me? I'm building systems again. Real systems, at a company that understands the difference between velocity and value. I lead a team of engineers who think about edge cases and failure modes, who take pride in building things that don't break. We move deliberately. We ship when we're ready. We measure success by the incidents that don't happen, by the disasters we prevent through thoughtful design. And I've never once regretted stepping aside that day when Chloe told me someone else shipped faster. Because stepping aside gave me the clarity to see what I really wanted. Not to be the fastest. Not to ship the most features. Not to win arguments about the right way to build systems. Just to work somewhere that valued the things I valued, where reliability mattered more than velocity, where preventing failures was considered just as important as delivering features. You know what's funny? Chloe was right about one thing. Bryce did ship features faster than me. He absolutely did. And for about 3 days, that looked like a win. Like proof that her approach was correct, that speed mattered more than caution, that my careful architecture was just overcomplicated perfectionism holding back progress. But systems don't reveal their true nature in 3 days. They reveal it over months and years, under stress and scale, when the decisions you made at the beginning either hold steady or crumble under pressure. And that's when the difference between fast and good becomes impossible to ignore. I think about that meeting sometimes, the one where she reassigned my work. How confident she seemed. How certain that she was making the right call. How completely unprepared she was for the consequences that would unfold from that casual decision. The truth is, I didn't bring Mountainfire to its knees through clever maneuvering. I didn't sabotage anything or manipulate anyone. I just stepped aside and let the consequences of their own decisions play out. I documented what I saw. I presented the facts. I gave them every opportunity to understand what they'd broken and how to fix it. And then I left, because ultimately the best revenge isn't destruction. It's walking away from people who don't value you and finding people who do. There's a particular kind of satisfaction in watching someone realize they've made a catastrophic mistake. Not the immediate realization, the one that comes with panic and scrambling. That's just chaos. I'm talking about the slow, creeping understanding that settles in over weeks and months. The kind where every new problem traces back to the same source, where every band-aid fix just reveals another layer of structural damage, where the full scope of what was lost becomes impossible to deny. I watched that happen to Mountainfire from the outside, through LinkedIn updates and industry gossip and occasional messages from former colleagues who needed to process what they were experiencing. The company lurched from crisis to crisis for months after I left. Small things at first: performance degradation in the API layer, intermittent timeout errors, mysterious data inconsistencies that nobody could track down. Then larger things: a security vulnerability that required emergency patching across the entire platform, a scalability problem that hit right as they were trying to onboard their biggest client of the year, a compliance audit that revealed gaps in their logging and monitoring infrastructure. Each incident by itself was manageable. Painful, expensive, reputation damaging, but manageable. What made it devastating was the pattern. Every problem pointed back to the same root cause: technical debt that had been allowed to accumulate unchecked, shortcuts that had been taken in the name of velocity, architectural decisions that had prioritized shipping over sustainability. The infrastructure I'd built had been strong enough to mask these problems for a while. But once Bryce started simplifying things he didn't understand, once Chloe's velocity-first approach became the dominant engineering culture, the structural weaknesses became impossible to hide. Frank reached out to me 4 months after I'd left. Not to offer me another job, not to try to bring me back. Just to talk, engineer to engineer, about what he was dealing with. We met for coffee near my new office, and he looked like he'd aged 5 years in those 4 months. "We're hemorrhaging senior talent," he told me. 3 more developers quit last month. Good ones, people we can't afford to lose. They all say the same thing: they're tired of fighting fires, tired of being blamed for problems they inherited, tired of working in a system that's fundamentally broken. I sipped my coffee and waited for him to get to the real reason he'd asked to meet. "Chloe's gone," he said finally. "Not just reassigned. Gone. The board let her go 2 weeks ago. Officially it was a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities. Unofficially, they'd lost confidence in her ability to lead technical strategy." I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. I'd expected it, honestly. You can't preside over that level of organizational decline without eventually facing consequences. But there was no satisfaction in it. Chloe had been wrong about a lot of things, but she'd also been a symptom of a larger problem: a board and executive team that hadn't understood what they were asking for when they demanded faster feature delivery. They'd wanted growth without growing pains, scale without scaling challenges, innovation without the messy work of building solid foundations. "What about Bryce?" I asked. Frank grimaced. "Still there. He's actually gotten better, believe it or not." The disasters humbled him. "He reads documentation now, asks questions before making changes, thinks about downstream impacts. He'll never be a great architect, but he's becoming a solid mid-level engineer. The problem is he's now one of our most experienced people on that part of the codebase because everyone else has left." That was the real tragedy of what had happened at Mountainfire. Not that they'd made mistakes, but that they'd lost the institutional knowledge to learn from them properly. When you drive out your experienced engineers, you lose more than their technical skills. You lose their pattern recognition, their ability to see problems coming before they arrive, their understanding of why things are built the way they are. You end up with a team that's constantly rediscovering lessons that should have been learned years ago. "Are you fixing it?" I asked. "The technical debt, the architectural problems?" "We're trying," Frank said. "But it's slow. We brought in the person you recommended as CTO, and she's good. Really good. But she's also realistic about how long this will take. We're talking years, Alice. Years of careful rebuilding while we're also trying to stay competitive and keep the clients we haven't lost yet. It's brutal. I nodded. I'd known it would be. Technical debt is insidious precisely because it makes everything harder. Every new feature takes longer to build. Every bug is harder to track down. Every change carries more risk. You can't just decide to fix it all at once because the business still needs to function, clients still need to be served, revenue still needs to be generated. So you're stuck doing this careful, exhausting work of rebuilding the plane while you're flying it, all while watching competitors who made better decisions pull ahead. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. Not sorry enough to regret leaving, but sorry that a company I'd once believed in had gotten to this point. Frank looked at me with something like envy. You landed on your feet. I did, I acknowledged. But that wasn't luck, Frank. I spent 6 years building a reputation for reliability. When I started interviewing, I had references who could speak to my technical judgment, a portfolio of systems that actually worked, and a clear understanding of what I wanted in my next role. I was selective. I turned down offers from companies that reminded me too much of what Mountainfire had become. What I didn't say, but what I think he understood, was that leaving had been an option for me precisely because I'd never compromised on quality. My work could speak for itself because I'd built things that lasted. If I'd followed Chloe's approach, if I'd optimized for velocity over everything else, I would have been just another developer with a resume full of projects that fell apart after I left. Instead, I was the architect whose systems were still running, still stable, even as everything around them crumbled. The conversation wound down after that. Frank went back to Mountainfire and its slow reconstruction. I went back to my new company, where I was building the next generation of their infrastructure platform. We'd probably never talk again. Our paths had diverged too completely. But I thought about that conversation a lot in the following weeks. About how close I'd come to staying, to fighting for the chance to be proven right, to rebuilding Mountainfire in my own image. It would have been satisfying in some ways. Triumphant even. The narrative would have been perfect: dismissed architect returns to save the day, proves her approach was correct all along, transforms the organization that undervalued her.